Minjal has, I think, adulted the most and given us this wonderful foliage.
Well, some would consider this very adulting.
Hi, welcome to Stationery Test Drive with Inky Memo. This is Minjal.
This is Vishal.
And I'm Samir. And today on our episode, we are going to be talking about the Camel Oil Pastel, which is a simple, probably student grade oil pastel, which we picked up from our local stationery store. And we are going to be testing this out. But before we do that, Vishal, what have you been up to?
I've been working on a couple of animated projects, and they're very much in the early stages, but I've mentioned them before on this series. But hopefully on screen you'll be able to see whatever progress has been made currently.
Ninja?
So I've been busy with the promotions of the Inky Memo merchandise. I hope you guys have seen it. And, if you all like it, please go ahead, buy them.
You have a notebook and you have a planner.
We have a notepad and we have the ultimate list pack, which is a fun
half party game, half deep self analysis,
mindfulness for fun. And Samir, what are you doing for mindfulness and or fun?
For mindfulness and fun, or at least that's how I sell it, I'm doing papercraft. And I've been working mostly on figuring out paper cutting and also upping my pop-up book game. And this is just one of the little experiments I did recently.
That does both of them. And this is a single sheet of paper, is it not?
Yeah, this is a single sheet of paper folded and creased into a little mini book.
Alright, and for more of that, you can find Samir at Papernautic, and we'll link to that in the description below for all of that. But right now, let's get down to colorful childhood crayons. Or at least that's what I grew up thinking they were. But these are oil pastels. So what are oil pastels, Samir?
Oil pastels are... I used to think oil pastels were probably something that were ancient, because you would think a stick of color with oil in it would have been invented thousands of years ago. But no. It was invented only in 1924 or so by Sakura in Japan. Strangely, oil pastels came about as an improvement of regular wax crayons. To make them more colorful, actually.
So what we grew up thinking as crayons were probably this, but because, it was well into the lifespan of this thing. But traditionally, crayons were with chalk bases, or...
No, a crayon is wax-based, and I think a lot of what we grew up with was also wax-based.
Yeah, because I know these are actually a lot easier to put down a line than crayons that I grew up with, which were extremely waxy.
And I think the reason crayons are more popular for parents to give kids is because they're not as easy to break as these.
Right, these are a bit fragile, but they are very well made, I must say, for... Maybe it's just because I'm an adult and I don't behave as or use them as roughly as a child would. Maybe if I went in like that.
Yeah.
But even then, it kind of holds well on a piece of paper anyway. My experience with oil pastels and crayons started very early. There is pictorial evidence of this, which should be on the screen right now. And my medium of choice was, while it was crayons, my surface of choice was not paper. It was the walls of our apartment when we were growing up, or where we lived for a couple of years anyway. And I think that association that is quite widespread. Most children start off with something like this. And so it was made for children, you say, in your research that came up.
Yes, there was a growing movement in the early 20th century in Japan and in many other places like Germany, where the kindergarten system started.
Kindergarten is a German word. So.
Exactly. And so even in Japan, there was a movement towards getting rid of more traditional rote education and including more creativity into it. there was a certain movement in Japan at the time which got very popular. There was a book, there was, all the buzzwords that you would find today in someone trying to introduce a new idea. And a pair of teachers wanted to have Japanese children have more colorful artistic pastimes rather than what they were being made to do, which was to just use India ink and memorize the ideograms of the language. So their idea was to give kids really colorful crayons to use, and that's how the Sakura company started. It was called Sakura Craypass when it first started, because they wanted to make crayons. What ended up happening is that they figured that crayons were just not actually colorful enough. And so they thought that if they made something that was a little bit more flexible, a little bit more rich in the pigment, and softer to work with, they would get children to play around more with them. And that's how the oil pastel was invented. It's quite a fascinating story.
And playing around with it is something that I found in the using of it that I enjoyed, because as an adult you approach these things and you think, okay, I'll do this thing with it and that thing with it. And honestly, all my early tests on this test drive were failures, utter failures, because I was just trying too hard to use them as an adult would and rather than as a child would.
Yeah.
But let's talk about it. We'll show these experiments and these test drives that we did on screen. So
let's just show all of
let's just
ours,
take this away for now. Minjal has, I think, adulted the most and given us this wonderful foliage.
Well, some would consider this very adulting. So,
I mean, I think most children are closer to being naked and lying down than adults, at least in. And I went full child. If this is on the screen, yes, it is. And we inadvertently or not always seem to come to this point in stationary test drive where the three of us
have chosen very different ways of dealing with the same thing.
Right. I think if there is nothing else, this spread, what is on screen right now, is a fitting indictment of what you can do with crayons as long as you lean into them quite well. Now, mine is clearly crayons on a page. I think, but yours, the two adults in the room have put in more effort. So why don't you tell us how you got to this rather than this?
The thing about oil pastels, there were two things that Sakura was aiming for when they invented them. One was the sheer richness of the color. If any of this is coming across on camera, yes, this looks like a crayon drawing, but you just cannot get this kind of rich, deep, pigmented color with a crayon. And that's something that an oil pastel just excels at, because it's using a binder that's not as hard and strong as wax. And so the pigment can really spread over the paper. Now, the spreading part of it is the second part. Oil pastels were also invented so that they could be more blendable on the page.
Yes, in fact, it says on the camel oil pastels that we have, it says in sort of, I guess the correct language is Hinglish. It says mixing ka magic, which is the magic of mixing. So these are made to be mixed on a page either by layering, like what I did, or using some kind of solvent.
Exactly. So the great thing about oil pastels is because the binder it's actually a mixture of things. The binder itself, it's
the oil in the oil pastel.
The non-drying oil is
exactly
one of the.
So the binder that binds the pigment and holds an oil pastel together, at least in the beginning, was a mixture of coconut oil, stearic acid, I think, and I'm forgetting, maybe it's gum arabic or something like that.
One of the naturally occurring gums.
Right. Now, the good thing about that is because coconut oil and the stearic acid keeps it kind of slightly fluid, is something that can kind of melt slightly as you work it into a paper. You can get effects with an oil pastel that can be very close to being like a painting, the sort of impasto
Right.
effect.
It's I forget the Italian name. It's probably impasto. It might be sfumato. I'm thinking where you layer, let's say, a green underneath. And we talked about this before that the Mona Lisa is green at some point. The base of her skin is green, and then on top of that there are all these layers of oil paint in thin films
Yeah.
that contribute to an overall color because it's slightly translucent.
Right. And the thing about oil pastels is you can do all of that layering. And because it's a material which doesn't ever quite dry out, you can scratch away the top surface, which is one of the ways it's used.
And this camel set comes with, very helpfully, a camel with various bits that are little edges and comb-like
I actually
features.
didn't use the scratching technique, so let me just try it out on my drawing. Because as I said, oil pastels never quite dry out.
Right, they're forever they're forever alive.
So you can see some of that line showing up.
Right, and you would use these. Let me use it on mine, one of the smaller edges. You would use these to pick out highlights. This is something that people do. And there you go. It gouges away some of the stuff. I've layered it a bit too much to get a clean break here. But yeah, I guess you can pull out highlights the way you would with a rubber. Here you're physically just taking off the medium.
Exactly. And as we said, blending is the other major strength of an oil pastel. As you can see, parts of this I have worked on very much like a crayon, very rough. This is again a cartridge paper with a bit of tooth. But you can see areas where it's very smooth. And the way you can do that is, as Vishal mentioned before, by mixing it in with a solvent. Now, I ended up using some sort of medical alcohol, which is actually not ideal for this. I think white spirit is probably the best thing to use. And I believe you can also use baby oil, which I think Minjal tried at some point a little, but not too much.
Tell us about your leaves, Minjal.
So after I bought the set, I realized that this set that we have is what students, are kind of advised to use. So in terms of, laying down the color, I had to really try very hard and, apply a lot of pressure to, get these really nice gradations and trying to...
So you've achieved quite a nice flat cover over the paper.
So I'm guessing you started with an undertone of a lighter color and then moved to dark, or was it the other way around?
No, I actually tried both.
Okay.
And I also used a pencil at the end to, define it and scratch out some of the color. Now, I believe that Camel also does an artist grade, oil pastel set, which would be interesting to try because I think it would, I hope, leave lesser residue than this one does.
I assume it would because the student version or the kids version, which is kind of what we are using.
Yeah, it does. It's quite a messy thing. You can't. Maybe you can see it in 4K, but it is.
Yeah, but I think it's also that it's not just that it's messy, but it's also probably made stronger than the artist version.
Right, because so kids will apply more pressure.
But by making it stronger, you're also making it more difficult to blend.
I did not blend at all, and you can see that here very clearly. In fact, I didn't really even think about this at all. This was as close to recapturing the stream of consciousness, I hope, thoughts that I had when I was about 2 or 3 and using oil pastels or crayons to make things. So yeah, you can hear some kids outside maybe, and I put myself in the mind of a child. I just drew. I picked up. I think I didn't even bother to look at what color I was picking up. So a lot of this is just whatever came to hand. I put it in. There was a bit of things here and there where I thought, okay, I'll keep a highlight here and there. These are just muscle memory at this point in terms of drawing portraits. Yeah, I quite liked. Actually, the thing I liked the most as I went along was, yes, mixing all of these things just by layering them over each other willy-nilly. But I did actually like the pure black on a rough paper. I think there's something that I would like to try, which is more graphic, than any of the things we've done here.
Yeah.
And I think it would work well with a crayon rather than with a more liquid medium like a brush or even a charcoal pencil or something, which I've never been as satisfied with. There's something quite, despite what we said, there's something quite clean about the line that you get out of this. It's very textured. It's very the weights can go all over the place, but you can get these really nice edges, like you see on the signature here. You can almost make it a wedge, and I can't think of other mediums that have so much virtuosity in terms of their expression.
And I think the thing I realized quite late while I was working on this is that there's the oil pastel, unlike most other mediums, actually varies a lot depending on what direction you use it in.
Right.
So
So-
most of the time, and I can demonstrate this.
Yeah, there's another paper there. We can use that.
So most of the time, what we're used to doing as artists who use a variety of mediums is to draw like we would usually draw, which is sideways. You either pull a line or you push a line. And maybe sometimes you do that. And you'll notice that all of these give a fairly rough line. Whereas the thing I realized just by chance as I was working on it is that if you push this,
You get a much
that's a very different line.
yeah. Yes, I noticed this as well.
This is a lot more like an oil painting, this look, than anything I can do this way. This is just a crayon.
And weirdly, you can also almost engage in pointillism by doing these kind of very
Yeah, that's
messy.
the other thing I didn't try.
It's
But for some reason, if you really push this into the paper, it's just an entirely different look than if I did it any other way. No matter how hard I pull rather, that's still a crayon. But this is something else. So I think the oil pastel is much more versatile than maybe even we have tested out in this first try of ours. But it's
can
something
you-
that requires...
while it's fresh, can you gouge out? Yes, you can.
Yes,
you
you
can
can.
get a really nice edge. You can literally see the pastel come off on the.
And of course, the way that a lot of people recommend you use this is, I think, to do something like that, and then maybe another layer. I don't know if it may not work on this paper because it's a little too smooth.
Yeah.
But as you can see, for something that's kind of a kid's medium, it allows for a lot of blending, even by layering.
So, do professional artists use oil pastels a lot, in our country, or is it a medium that artists don't prefer to use?
I think it very much started as a children's medium, but just the sheer practicality
Plasticity.
of being able to carry around these very bright pigments in your pocket eventually kind of attracted real artists as well.
Yeah, I believe Picasso was the one who actually, for this very reason, got one of the biggest French stationery manufacturers to actually make an artist grade oil pastel set.
Right, because the thing about oil pastels is it was invented for a very specific, very, let's say, casual, non-professional reason. So the materials that went into it were not made ideally to be very
Archival.
Most artists like to work on, for example, acid-free paper, so that the paper doesn't degrade over time. It can last hundreds of years. But the binder in this has stearic acid.
Right.
So if you use an acid-free paper and then you're using a medium that has an acid in it, the acid in the medium is slowly eating away at the paper over decades, of course. But that means that especially a cheaper oil pastel piece might last only a few decades rather than a century.
Right.
So there are no fixative oils or varnishes or...
Believe it or not, this is still such a new medium that people are still testing these things out. So the problem is that once you put it down on paper, the oil and the stearic acid from this kind of is slowly seeping into the paper over the next few decades.
Right.
And then affecting the paper itself. I believe what some people are trying out now is to kind of coat this entire thing in like a beeswax fixative or something, so
So
that
the
it kind
paper
of
itself is coated, or is
no
it
after the piece is done, I believe.
okay? So
Um,
so if nothing else, it will just sort of remain in stasis
Right.
for as long
so
as
it
possible.
just holds off all the reactions for as long as possible, and
Right.
I believe art conservators are still trying to work out the chemistry of how to best keep this stuff alive because it was just never meant to be that serious, but it's now become serious.
And then there'll be no excuse not to keep your 5-year-old's drawings forever. Well, whether these last forever or not, I think we had fun making them. I don't think this is the last time that we're going to try out or test drive oil pastels. I've certainly learned many new ways to try it, and also more simplistic ways, I think.
And I don't think any of us would have chosen such bombastic colors in any
Right.
other medium,
Yeah.
which is great that it's forcing us to push that
Yeah, usually
side of our
even
experiments.
usually you pick a palette that's very like 3 or 4 colors, and you don't go for the really edgy ones. You just kind of do that, and then you layer and layer, and you can certainly work that way. But I think if you embrace your inner child, and and these are pretty inexpensive, so you don't need to get the professional ones that Picasso commissioned, unless that's the kind of thing you want to do. We fully support people spending their money how they want on art supplies, at least. Get something from Inky Memo. Why not? That's a good idea as well.
But yes, other than
The mess.
making the clear mess that we have
Yeah,
now
that's
made,
right. Yeah.
I think, as Minjal said, we should test out something that's a bit more of a professional grade oil pastel at some point. It will be interesting to see what the differences
It
will
is no more mess than a bunch of eraser shavings, though. Let's be honest. It's hardly. They're colorful, so they do kind of stay
It's,
in a bit.
it's
but-
nowhere close to the mess that we're going to get into once we try to test out a charcoal pencil.
Oh yes, that, like I said, it's, for me, the black on this is better than a charcoal pencil. So I don't quite look forward to it, but then I didn't look forward to these, and they turned out to be great. So maybe even that will surprise me. Are there any more surprises that we had with this, or is it just that we should continue to?
No, I think in general it's just a medium that was invented for a very specific purpose, and maybe people like us are kind of trying it out in ways that it was not meant to be used to begin with. And I think even serious artists are finding those challenges as they try to use these. And it will be interesting to see how these develop because they are relatively new. I'm sure they will
Yeah.
improve over time.
As newer materials, newer chemicals, newer techniques for making things, maybe there's going to be some kind of 3D printing angle that I've not thought of for making a multicolored, multi-layered, multi-patterned oil pastel that also does not break down.
But yes, the more stationery people invent, the better for us. So bring it on.
Yeah, we look forward to more of crayons, more of oil pastels. We should actually look into crayons and see what those are like as compared to these. Because I don't think most people, including us, really know the difference or make the distinction. It's that waxy thing that you use as a kid, and then you move on to color pencils, and then you move on to watercolors, and then you die.
Hopefully famous and not having made all the money that your watercolor painting.
Well, if you're famous, then you get companies to commission new crayons for you. Clearly, if you're Picasso, so
we can all hope.
we can all hope. Whatever your stationery endeavors are, I hope you enjoy them like we did with this. I hope you share them with us. You can find us online at inkymemo.com, on most social media at inkymemo, and individually you can find me at allvishal, ALLVISHAL, on social media and at the .com. Minjal?
I'm at Minjal Kadakia.
And I'm at Samir Bharadwaj and Paper Nautic for the paper stuff.
And before we go, use those pastels.